Slides, we'll talk about another major development in the biosocial domain, and that is motor skills. During the preschool years, motor skills are going to improve dramatically, and that is due to the maturation of the brain and, of course, muscles. We have two types of motor skills: gross motor skills and fine motor skills. Gross motor skills are basically those physical abilities that involve large body movements. So, children who can ride a tricycle, throw a ball, or catch a ball, or swing, or ride, or climb a structure. These are all large body movements. Boys tend to be ahead of girls in gross motor skills, yet the influence of culture, of course, and the locale is very important. A child who has never been exposed to a tricycle will not learn how to ride a tricycle. A child who was never exposed to a swing will not be able to swing. So, exposure, experience are also important to the development of motor skills. Another very important factor is really the advancement that happens in the brain. So, a lot of those tasks require coordination, and coordination requires that both sides of your body be able to work together. Again, sending messages to both sides of the brain and interaction between the right and the left hemisphere, as we discussed. Fine motor skills refer to those abilities involving small body movements, and these are things that you will notice when you do your observation, mostly when children are engaging in maybe tabletop activities or at the sand table, or even getting ready to go outside, putting on their jacket or tying their shoes. So it's as simple as winking or whistling or smiling to major fine motor developments, such as tying your own shoes or cutting a straight line or around the circle, holding the pencil. That pincer grasp and those fine motor skills are going to get better and better with, of course, practice and maturation of the brain. Again, we see a little bit of difference that is tied to gender. On average, fine motor skills mature about 6 months earlier in females than in males. Now, with the maturation of the fine motor and the gross motor and the ability, the mobility of children during this age, there is another problem that kind of occurs during this age, and that is the exposure to accidents. And this is predominantly due to the fact that children are still trying to balance that impulsivity with control. So they might be prone to rush to do things or attempt to do things that are not safe without really processing the danger behind it. In the United States, 4 times as many 1 to 4-year-olds die of accidents than of the leading cause of death for this age group, and that is cancer. And of course, the impulsiveness, the curiosity, and the advancement in their motor skills are all reasons for that. And this is why we see that the top related injuries are usually poison and drowning. Poison has to do with household items that children might get into and ingest or inhale, and of course, medications, and then also drownings, especially in households where the pool is not gated and locked, and children tend to sneak out and unfortunately might drown and lose their life. In order to prevent injury, and this is a term that officials prefer to use than accidents, because accidents give the impression that they are inevitable, whereas injury control or injury prevention is a plan that is placed with different levels to kind of curb the occurrence of accidents from happening. And it starts with what is called primary prevention. And primary prevention is basically all those actions that we're going to take in order to change the general background or condition that could make the harm possible. So if in the case of, let's say, a child being hit by a car, if you look at the primary prevention stage, you would probably be looking at providing sidewalks for pedestrians to walk safely, or bridges or overpasses, or even designing cars nowadays that actually can sense the presence of someone in front of it and actually brake by themselves. On the second level, or the secondary preventive level, you're actually looking at zooming in on an area that you know that is possibly a dangerous area. So in general, we are going to take precaution for all people who walk to be safe. So we're going to build those sidewalks. But then we know that there is a higher risk around the area of schools, because school children tend to be a little bit more impulsive and might not be able to look around and cross safely. So the secondary prevention level would say, okay, then around that area, to avert harm in high-risk situations, we're going to hire a school crossing guard, or place some alerting flashing lights on school buses, or have a law, for example, that requires people to stop at a particular intersection. So these are the second layer of prevention that is aimed at higher risk situations, not the general. General would be the primary, secondary would be the higher risk, and then comes the tertiary prevention. Tertiary prevention, remember that it happens after the incident occurs. So it starts at the beginning of the injury. So once an injury occurs, a child got hit, then the tertiary preventive measure is to actually get the help as fast as possible to that child. So a speedy ambulance might be part of the tertiary preventative measure, or punishing that person that actually ran a red light, or hit and run drivers. All of those are measures that are taken after the fact, after the injury had occurred. In addition to accidents from poison and drowning, when we talk about children during this stage, we also talk about child maltreatment. And child maltreatment includes both child abuse and child neglect. Child abuse is pretty much what we think of when we think of physical abuse, but it also goes to include emotional abuse and sexual abuse. So both of them are considered child abuse. And we kind of talked about this a little bit when we talked about shaken baby syndrome, and how that an injury like this is one of those things that kind of alerts doctors and nurses in ER of the possibility of child abuse occurring. Now, when it comes to preschoolers, now we're talking about certain injuries that might be attributed to child abuse, such as fractured bones or broken bones, multiple broken bones, or bruises or cuts, or um, um, some sort of emotional neglect that shows that the child is highly alert or withdrawn. And in the case of sexual abuse, some sort of interest or knowledge that should not be there around that age group. So all of those are indicators of the child being possibly subjected to child abuse. Child neglect is also a part of child maltreatment. However, it is defined as the failure to meet a child's basic physical, education, or emotional needs. And this is one of the hardest things to pinpoint, because people tend to overlook child neglect due to the fact that it is not really seen most of the time, or it is not really understood. Many people think of it as personal or getting in people's business, when in fact it is actually worse than abuse, and the incidence is much higher than child abuse. And we see examples of this with children who sometimes show up at preschools with dressed in clothing that shows that the parent did not care to change them or bathe them, or actually withholding their education, or even satisfying their emotional needs. So that connection, that attachment is actually being withheld from them, or even in some severe cases, they are actually being treated with harsh consequences whenever there is a comparison between getting what you want and withholding love, let's say, from them if they did not perform certain tasks as the parent wants them to. Now, with the case of child maltreatment, we know that probably you've heard many times of people calling or making a call or filing a claim when they see or suspect some sort of child maltreatment or child abuse. When you make a call to, say, CPS or a police officer, you're creating what is called a reported case. So basically, reporting maltreatment is you suspecting that there is a maltreatment, abuse, or neglect, and you have notified the authorities of it. What happens is, once you made that report, it has to be substantiated in order for anyone to actually act upon it. And so a substantiated maltreatment is basically a report that was made, and then somebody from the agency went ahead and investigated it and verified it. The problem is that there's always more reported cases than substantiated ones, because of many factors, such as the fact that every single mandated reporter is a person that has to, by law, report a suspicion. And a suspicion means that you do not have the need to investigate it. All you need to have is just a hunch or a suspicion or a reason to believe that there is some sort of an abuse happening. So you saw marks on the child, or you noticed something in the behavior, and or the child said something, and that is enough for you to just make that phone call. Now, the substantiated means that somebody took that phone call and that report and went ahead and paid a visit to the family or seen the child and verified. And many of those incidents end up being either verified or not verified, because it's much harder to find proof for certain maltreatment cases. This table is very interesting because it kind of gives you an idea, if you end up working in the early childhood field or working with children in general, of what kind of red flags can get your attention, or should get your attention if you see them, and could signal some sort of a maltreatment. Now remember, it's probably working with children, you will probably see each and every one of those at one point. So it is not simply seeing at one time, it is the repetitive pattern that you might see that can signal that there is something wrong in this picture. So slow physical growth doesn't necessarily mean that the child is being neglected. Slow physical growth could very much be attributed to a child being sick, or there's actually a hardship that the parent is going through. And but when you see it repetitively, and the child is constantly, for example, coming to school with unclean clothes, or not bathed, or a foul smell from their mouth, or their hair's not combed, and you notice that sometimes they actually miss school a lot, or they have frequent change in their caregivers, then you start to connect the dots. This is when you start. So you need at least 2 or 3 of those to be able to actually start to think that, maybe something is going on and I need to call someone. Now, once the suspicion happens, again, we want to initiate the levels of prevention, just like we did with accidents. So with the levels of prevention to maltreatment, we start with the bigger picture, which always, the primary is always the bigger picture. So we're going to look at the social network, the support around that parent. Before we punish the parent for doing something, we need to see if that parent might be going through something and they need some sort of a support and alliance. So social network support, neighborhood, parental education, and income, these are all reasons for stress, and that stress could create that abuse. So taking care of that as the primary, then going into the secondary, and we said the secondary is focusing on the incident or the high-risk incident. So spotting those warning signs that we talked about in this table. And if we spot them, then we initiate that mandated reporter call and try to get help for that family. The final preventative measure is, we said, always something that happens after the fact, after the maltreatment has actually occurred. And this is going to be in 2 directions. One, to help the caregiver. So if the caregiver is being abusive because of their addiction, or their inability to care to of the child, then we need to get help to that caregiver. And at the same time, while we're doing this, we are taking care of the child. So removing the child from that harmful environment, placing them in one of those options. The permanency planning would include foster care or adoption, or any form, or kinship, any form to protect the child while the caregiver is getting the help they need.